The Prime Minister tries to regain authority as she apologises for the mistakes she's made so far in number 10.
How long can the Prime Minister last?
There were many questions for ministers arriving for Cabinet, but Liz Truss insists to the BBC that she's carrying on.
I will lead the Conservatives into the next general election.
Definitely.
Well, look, yeah. I'm not focused on internal debates within the Conservative Party.
The new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, was expected to tell ministers that they'll need to agree savings in their departments by the end of the week. The Trades Union Congress says UK families are at breaking point as the country experiences the longest squeeze on real wages since the 1800s. We'll have the very latest from the TUC conference in Brighton and from Westminster, also this lunchtime. Ukraine's president says nearly a third of his country's power stations have now been destroyed after another round of Russian airstrikes on energy facilities. Fears grow for a female Iranian athlete who competed in a climbing competition without wearing a hijab. Her family say they've lost contact with her. And the environment campaigner Greta Thunberg tells the BBC why she doesn't want to go into politics.
It feels like that world is so toxic, but also, as it is now, the changes necessary will only come if there is enough public pressure from the outside.
And coming up on the BBC News Channel, we'll hear from one of the men trying to find a future for Wasps, the Premiership Rugby Club in administration and looking for a buyer to save the club.
Hello and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The Prime Minister Liz Truss chaired a meeting of the Cabinet this morning after apologising last night for the mistakes made since she entered number 10. Speaking to the BBC, she admitted her premiership so far hadn't been perfect, but said she would lead the Conservatives into the next general election. This despite widespread criticism from within her own party. Yesterday, the new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, scrapped most of her tax-cutting plans, announced only last month. Our political correspondent Helen Catt has the latest, first from Westminster.
Is it time for Liz Truss to go?
Cabinet ministers leaving their weekly meeting in Downing Street.
Is she finished now? Has she made too many mistakes?
A united front, but they know the Prime Minister is in serious jeopardy. Their programme for government is now radically different.
Prime Minister, who is to blame?
Last night, Liz Truss told the BBC she was sorry.
First of all, I do want to accept responsibility and say sorry for the mistakes that have been made. I wanted to act, but to help people with their energy bills, to deal with the issue of high taxes, but we went too far and too fast. I've acknowledged that. I've put in place a new Chancellor with a new strategy to restore economic stability. And now what I'm focused on is delivering for the public.
But Ms Truss said she wasn't going anywhere.
I will lead the Conservatives into the next general election.
Definitely.
Well, look, yeah. I'm not focused on internal debates within the Conservative Party.
But you need to be, don't you?
I am focused.
You need to be in order to stay in office.
The important thing is that I've been elected to this position to deliver for the country.
And you're staying put, however bad the poll ratings get, however much noise there is amongst your own backbenchers, you're not shifting.
I will stay in the job to deliver for the national interest.
Many of her MPs are not so sure. Inside the Houses of Parliament, her future is being actively discussed. From a government minister this morning, a warning not to move against her.
I can't see, and neither can the vast majority of my colleagues, how the answer to the current situation is to indulge in even more political instability with all the economic impact that brings.
Liz Truss continues to meet different groups of her MPs to try to reach out and shore up support. Some of them think that she should be given at least a little time to try to turn things around. She did, they say, after all, win the leadership contest fair and square. And even those who've already decided they think she should go are considering taking a little time too, as they really want to avoid any sort of messy process to find a successor. The Chancellor headed to work knowing he may have brought an opportunity for some calm, at least until he delivers his next financial statement on Halloween. Labour remains unconvinced.
In the end, the markets are about confidence and credibility, and this government has absolutely shot their credibility on economics. And I don't think they can ever stand up before the British public again and say that we're the party of sound money. They've shot them. They've absolutely shot that to pieces.
Other parties agree.
We're in an absolute crisis because we've got a Prime Minister whose authority has been absolutely shredded. Prime Minister quite simply should have gone. This has been a financial experiment, but it's been a financial experiment that brings with it a price.
There's a lot of suffering out there, and even though we've seen a whole range of U-turns by the Conservatives, their serious economic mistakes are hurting millions of people.
As we know, things can change very quickly in Westminster. Tomorrow, Liz Truss will face the full force of the Commons for the first time since her U-turn. Political danger still very much lurks, even when things look like they're calming. Helen Catt, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's go there and join our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. And so what happens now, Nick?
Well, Jane, there are active conversations happening in Parliament today about Liz Truss's future. I think there's a bit of a split in the Conservative Party between those who want to get rid of her immediately and some who want, quite frankly, a few days of calm. My sense is that she does have a bit space today, but as Helen was just reflecting, things could move very quickly here if more goes wrong. The Chancellor spent the morning at Cabinet outlining to ministers that they will have to make cuts over the next few months to try and balance the books. He made up 32 billion of the black hole yesterday, but there are still tens of billions that will have to be made up before he can convince the markets that there's a full plan to bring spending under control. And that could mean more trouble ahead. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, is prepared to resign if the government doesn't keep to its pledge to increase defence spending. Well, I'm told the defence spending won't be ring-fenced. There are other big commitments that the Prime Minister made on the triple lock for pensions, on the last government anyway, on increasing benefits by the rate of inflation. These are other things that are potential flashpoints that in those spending cuts, if the Chancellor makes controversial decisions, there will be government ministers and Tory backbenchers who will be extremely unhappy. For now, the Prime Minister is holding on, but the key part of that sentence, for now.
Nick, thank you very much. Nick Eardley there at Westminster. Well, the new Chancellor's plans include ending the energy price guarantee early. It will end in April. The Resolution Foundation, the think tank focused on improving living standards for low and middle income households, says even people on medium-sized incomes may be unable to pay their electricity and gas bills next year. Let's talk to our business correspondent, Theo Leggett. That change from April then, Theo, what does that all mean? Because we know how bad energy prices are.
It means that the government is going to have to come up with some kind of new support scheme which it hopes will cost it less. What Jeremy Hunt has done is said that the original energy price guarantee was meant to last for 2 years. That capped the average price paid by an average household at £2,500 a year. The problem with it was that was irrespective of how high international gas prices would go. The problem that caused was that it meant the government was facing an open-ended bill. Tens, possibly even hundreds of billions of pounds. So that's the kind of thing that upsets investors, makes them nervous. He's ended that. Until April, people will still have security about how much their energy will cost. But after that, the risk will be back onto consumers and energy prices could go sky high again. That's what forecasters are suggesting. They could go as high as £4,000 a year, £4,300 in the spring. So you have to assume that at some point the government will have to review this and say we'll bring in a replacement scheme which will at least help the poorest people, and that will still cost money, but less money than the original energy price guarantee would have done.
Yes, and Energy prices, of course, something that affects absolutely everyone, concern across the board. A lot of concern, though, as well for people with mortgages. How much is known? What's your sense of what would happen there?
Well, since the new Chancellor made his announcements, the yields on government bonds, which is effective, which matches up with what the government will have to pay for its own borrowing, have gone down. Now, that does affect the price of fixed-rate mortgages, and it should take some of the heat out of fixed-rate mortgages. We've seen the rates climbing quite steeply in recent weeks. The abandoning of a number of potential tax cuts, the mini-budget tax-cutting package, most of that's gone now. Now, that was seen by people in the financial markets as inflationary. Removing a lot of that means that when the Bank of England next discusses interest rates, it may not have to increase them quite as much as it would have done otherwise. So it will still be increasing interest rates, that's pretty certain, with inflation around 10%, but perhaps not by as much as it otherwise would have done. And that means for people taking out variable rate mortgages, the level will still be going up, but not quite as much as it would have done otherwise.
All right, thanks very much for now. Theo Leggett, our business correspondent. The communications watchdog says people on benefits are missing out on cheaper broadband deals because providers aren't always publicising them. Ofcom says only a small fraction of eligible customers are getting the chance to sign up to a social tariff of about £15 a month. That should be available to anyone who is on universal credit. And just to tell you that tomorrow we will have a day of coverage across the BBC finding out how the rise in living costs is affecting you. We'll be in Sunderland all day providing support and advice from experts and speaking to small businesses and families. That's cost of living, tackling it together all day tomorrow. France has been hit by a wave of strikes, with teachers and transport workers among the people not showing up for work today. Staff at the country's oil refineries and depots have already been on strike for several weeks, causing fuel shortages across the country. There's been another round of Russian airstrikes on Ukraine's energy facilities. President Zelensky says nearly a third of the country's power stations have been destroyed. Our Ukraine correspondent Hugo Bechega sent us this report.
Another morning in Ukraine, another power station targeted by Russia. This one in Kyiv was hit by missiles at around 9 o'clock today. To the west, Zhytomyr was also struck. The governor said an energy facility was hit. For hours, the entire city was without power and water. This is how Russia is responding to military defeats on the battlefield. The recent strikes have destroyed a third of the country's energy infrastructure, according to President Zelensky. Yesterday, the offices of the energy company and this residential building were hit. 5 people were killed here, including a pregnant woman. More and more civilian sites have been hit by Russia in cities across the country, away from the front lines. Attacks like this shake people's perception of relative safety, but they also seem to be part of a strategy to destroy this country's critical energy infrastructure ahead of winter. So what can Ukrainians do? This family has lost almost everything in the war and is concerned about losing even more.
Of course we are worried. We worry for our children because they are afraid of the dark. It's difficult to explain to them what's happening.
Ukrainians have been told to do their part by saving electricity, but Russia's targeted attacks are likely to continue. Hugo Bechega, BBC News, Kyiv.
Well, Russia now says 13 people were killed, including 3 children, when a fighter jet on a training flight crashed into a residential building close to the border with Ukraine. One image shows a massive explosion and flames engulfing the 9-story building as the pilots parachuted to safety. One of the plane's pilots said an engine had caught fire. Fears are growing for a female Iranian athlete who competed in a climbing competition at the weekend without wearing a hijab, which is against Iran's strict rules. Al-Nasra Kabi, who is 33, was competing in South Korea, but her family and friends say they lost contact with her yesterday after she told them she was with an Iranian official. There have been widespread protests in Iran following the death of Mahsa Amini, the young woman who'd been arrested by the country's morality police. Well, let's find out the latest from BBC Persian's Rani Rahimpour. Rani, the young woman in question today, this young athlete, explain first of all what we know about her, what's the latest on her situation?
Al-Nasra Kabi is an Iranian climber who was competing at the Asian competition in South Korea. And in an act of defiance against the rules of the Islamic Republic of Iran, she competed without hijab or the compulsory headscarf, which was a very bold move. The video of the competition quickly became viral. Many Iranian protesters called her a hero of the people, and they were planning to go and visit her at the airport. The flight was meant to arrive tomorrow morning. But we yesterday found out that she had gone missing for a couple of hours. Family and friends couldn't reach her. And then we found out that she was put on a flight by Iranian officials. Her passport and her phone was confiscated. So she was being taken back to Iran earlier than intended. In the meantime, she has written a story on her Instagram on which she has apologized for causing any concerns. And she said that the removal of hijab was unintentional and a mistake, which the story itself has created even more concerns because it looks like she's under a lot of pressure.
And all of this, of course, part of the wider picture we've seen, extraordinary bravery in recent weeks, the protests, and a situation that continues, some protests that continue.
Exactly. So we're now in the 5th week of anti-regime protests in Iran, which started as a protest against compulsory hijab. And many believe that Al-Nasra Kabi's move was in solidarity of what was going on in Iran. Many people have been killed. Over 200 people, according to human rights organizations, have been killed. Thousands are in prison, and the protests continue. It all started as a protest against compulsory hijab, but it's now an anti-regime protest.
Rani, thank you very much indeed for the latest. Thank you. The time is 17 minutes past 1. Our top story this lunchtime. The Prime Minister is trying to regain authority as she apologises for the mistakes she's made so far in number 10. And still to come, the Ministry of Defence is trying to crack down on former UK pilots who are being lured to help train the Chinese military.
Coming up on the BBC News Channel, we'll have the latest from the T20 World Cup, where there has been the first hat-trick of the competition. Find out if it helped UAE to victory over Sri Lanka.
The General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress has called for a general election in a scathing attack on the government. Addressing her final annual meeting before stepping down from the role, Frances O'Grady pledged more strike action across the country and said workers shouldn't have to pay the price for the government's mess. Our employment correspondent Zoe Conway reports.
At the TUC in Brighton, there is anger. Anger about pay not keeping up with inflation. And there is fury at the government. This month, hundreds of thousands of public sector workers are being balloted on whether they want to strike.
If ministers and employers keep hammering pay packets at the same rate, UK workers are on course to suffer 2 decades, 20 years of lost living standards. Over the next 3 years alone, real earnings are set to fall by another £4,000.
Wilma will be voting to join a picket line in Scotland. She's been a nurse for 35 years.
People, because of COVID, are now absolutely exhausted. They're suffering from PTSD. They are demoralised, and they just can't be taken for granted anymore, and that's what's made them really, really angry. We won't be worried about people coming out on strike. What will happen is we're worried about how we keep them in, because they are so angry.
She says her colleagues are struggling to survive on their pay.
I met a healthcare support worker who works in the community with elderly patients between community and hospital, and she told me that she's already decided she's not putting her heating on this year because she can't afford to eat and heat. So what they've done, she lives with her partner, they've bought extra blankets, they've bought 2 hot water bottles each, and that's how they're going to keep warm this year.
Helen has been a teacher for 20 years and will also vote to strike.
Teachers have seen their pay drop in value enormously. We are, every year we're taking another cut. The 5% that's on offer at the moment is yet another cut in real terms.
Tomorrow, unions are expected to vote to coordinate any strike action. This winter could see the greatest industrial action in a decade. Some union leaders predict 1 million workers will walk out. The government says it wants to minimise any disruption caused by industrial action. It also says it's determined to make work pay, which it says it's why that the national living wage was increased back in April by its biggest amount since its introduction in 2016.
Zoe, thank you. Zoe Conway there at the Congress in Brighton. The Queen Elizabeth II Bridge remains closed for a second day as a protest continues to cause wide-scale disruption. The crossing takes traffic southbound over the River Thames in London, connecting the M25 orbital motorway from Essex to Kent. The group Just Stop Oil says its action is in protest against new government oil and gas licences. John Donnison reports.
More than 400 feet above the Thames, you can just about make out their orange banner. Hanging in hammocks, the 2 climate activists who shut down one of Britain's busiest bridges. The group they're from is called Just Stop Oil. They want the government to stop issuing new licences for oil and gas exploration, and they say their increasingly extreme action is necessary.
Unfortunately, those less disruptive ways are nowhere near as effective. We have tried doing marches, we tried holding placards on the side of the road. It doesn't work. This is an emergency. Expect us anywhere, expect things to escalate. I empathise with everybody who has been disrupted. I really do. And the government can end this anytime they want by issuing a meaningful statement to say that there should be no new fossil fuel licences in the UK.
And it certainly has caused disruption. Drivers backed up after the police shut the bridge because of safety concerns.
It's a bit crazy, to be honest, as well. Like, I've just seen up there, and it's like, it's not safe at all. Like, it's crazy, disrespectful, to be honest.
Well, I think probably underlying message is probably something people need to listen to, but I think the ways they go about it is obviously something that needs to be addressed as well, because they can't bring the country to a halt in different places. That's not appropriate.
And the local MP isn't happy either.
We've already got severe traffic problems in Dartford. We've also got very bad air quality in Dartford, and their actions simply add to it. And that's why I say it's very counterproductive of them. These so-called environmentalists think that they're somehow helping the environment by their actions. They're not. They're deluded, and they're causing nothing but misery for local people.
Morning.
The recently appointed Home Secretary says the government's new public order bill, which is currently going through Parliament, would crack down on such protests. Just Stop Oil says more than 450 of its members have been arrested during more than 2 weeks of action. But they're warning to expect an escalation rather than a climb down. John Donnison, BBC News.
Up to 30 former UK military pilots are thought to have travelled to China to train members of the Chinese military. The Ministry of Defence says the practice isn't illegal, but it is trying to deter pilots from doing this. The pilots are often offered large sums of money to share their knowledge. Let's find out more from our security correspondent, Gordon Carrera. It sounds extraordinary on the face of it. Explain what has been going on and what the government is saying about it.
Yeah, this has caused widespread amazement, I think, that these former retired British military pilots have gone to China to train the Chinese military. But it's not illegal. So this happens through intermediaries, through headhunters. It started with a few cases about 3 years ago, slowed down with the pandemic, but has recently been increasing. And that's caused alarm, I think, in the Ministry of Defence. And they're being offered quite large packages, $270,000, £240,000 to go off to China and to do this training. But the problem for the Ministry of Defence is it's not currently illegal. They're not technically breaching the Official Secrets Act, which I think has surprised some people. So hence we've had this very unusual public alert about this activity, which is designed to basically, I think, embarrass and deter those who might be out there, but also stop anyone else who might be thinking about it, who's in the current military, because they are being approached, we understand, with similar packages after they retire. Would they be interested in doing this? Because the concern is it could pose a threat to UK security, even if they're not providing a specific secret. If they're giving an understanding of the tactics and capabilities of fast jets and helicopters, that could be useful to China, which I think is increasingly seen as an adversary. So we've had this warning. The government is also saying that a national security bill currently going through Parliament may also introduce new powers which could actually help stop this kind of activity as well.
All right, Gordon, thank you. Gordon Carrera. 4 years ago, a 15-year-old Greta Thunberg went on strike from school in Sweden and began her own journey to global fame. The climate activist has sailed across the Atlantic, scolded politicians and raised awareness of environmental causes. Now she's curated a manual about the key challenges confronting not just the green movement, but in her view, all humanity. It's called The Climate Book, and our media editor, Amol Rajan, met her to discuss some of its key themes.
She's become the unlikely voice of modern activism. Greta Thunberg is the Swedish teenager whose school strike to raise awareness of climate change caught global attention.
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
So did her impassioned pleas in front of world leaders and fans closer to home.
Justice, climate, climate. Exactly. Thank you so much, Glastonbury.
She's now created a book of essays written by her and over 100 experts by way of a toolkit for those concerned about climate change.
I want to explore some of your views on some of these complex policy issues where you do have to make choices and governments do have to make choices.
I pretty much never go into specific things to talk about because that distracts from the crisis itself. For example, nuclear power.
Yeah.
That is something that is being used a lot by people to distract because it's something that people feel so strongly about.
But isn't it part of the mix of a green agenda?
If we were to build to replace our current fossil fuel generated energy with nuclear power, we don't have the time to do that because our CO2 budget runs out in less than a decade at current emissions.
Would you ever go into politics?
I don't want to.
Why? Don't you feel an obligation, a duty?
It feels like that world is so toxic. But also, the main reason is that I don't, as it is now, the changes necessary will only come if there is enough public pressure from the outside.
To what extent is it fair to describe you as an opponent of economic growth?
I think that it's very naive to think that we can continue like now as business as usual, as economic growth is like today, that we can continue to expand and still stay in line with our emissions targets.
So let me ask you a related question, which is, to what extent would it be fair to describe you as an opponent of capitalism?
I think that all ideologies, capitalism included, have failed.
How can you say capitalism has failed when capitalism is one of the reasons that 850 million people are no longer living in absolute poverty in China?
If we continue on the path that we are today, it will mean that we are wrecking our future living conditions and our life supporting systems will break down, which will mean increased poverty, which will mean that people slip back into poverty. It will mean more famine.
You've used humour a lot on social media when you're trolled by world leaders, and you respond by trolling them back.
I just think it's genuinely funny. I mean, the most powerful people in the world are feel intimidated by teenagers. That is funny. It says more about them than it does about me.
Do you actually enjoy being the face of a global movement? It sounds like it comes with quite a lot of pressure.
I mean, it was certainly not what I intended to do. And sometimes I can snap and say, if you think that all the hope in the world rests on like burned out teenagers' shoulders, I mean, that's not very good.
Greta, it's a real pleasure to chat to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And you can see the full version of that interview. Amol Rajan interviews Greta Thunberg. That's tonight on BBC Two. It's at 7:30 or, of course, afterwards on the iPlayer. And just to tell you briefly, it is also a big day for the BBC today because it's celebrating its 100th birthday.
Hello, Marconi House, London, calling.
Those were the first words spoken on the BBC on October the 18th, 1922. And these are some of the thousands of people who've featured on our screens and airwaves since then. A range of programming and commemorative events is being held over the next few weeks to mark this anniversary. The King will be taking part in a special edition of The Repair Shop. And in Strictly, dancers will be performing to some well-known BBC theme tunes. Let's take a look right now, as ever, at the weather prospects. Ben Rich is with me. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Jane. The first TV weather forecast was back in 1954, so not quite 100 years ago, but there have been plenty since then, and they haven't all looked quite as good as this one, because we've got some beautiful blue skies and sunshine overhead in many places right now. However, that is set to change, and it's because of this swirl of cloud out in the Atlantic, a really big area of low pressure, which slowly but surely will start to take control of our weather. Not just yet. Most of us stay with sunshine through the rest of the afternoon. Some cloud feeding into eastern Scotland and northeast England on quite a chilly northerly breeze. The temperatures here just 12 degrees for Aberdeen. Further south and west, 18 there for Plymouth, where, as you can see, by the end of the day, things will be changing. We'll see some cloud. We'll see some showers. In fact, some thunderstorms breaking out across the southwest of England, drifting up into Wales as we go through the evening. Could be torrential downpours in places, some quite frequent lightning, and it will turn quite windy as well. Some of those showers could get into Northern Ireland by the end of the night. Most other areas will be dry, but with extensive cloud, maybe the odd spot of drizzle across parts of northern and eastern Scotland, northeast England. 6 degrees for Glasgow, but very mild to start the day down towards the south. So let's take a look at tomorrow. This big area of low pressure does start to make its move. You can see various frontal systems rotating around that. We will see showers or longer spells of rain actually through the next few days. Tomorrow will bring some warm weather for many, particularly in the south. Something rather chilly though holding on across northern parts, where we will start the day mostly dry but rather cloudy across eastern Scotland, northeast England. We'll see some showers drifting northwards through the day, but they will tend to weaken as they go. Best of any sunshine tomorrow, likely to be across parts of the Midlands and into eastern England. Now, it is going to be a windy day. Those are the average wind speeds, but quite gusty in places, particularly around some west coasts of Wales. Could see gusts of around 45 miles per hour. Temperatures, though, look at that, 22 degrees in Jersey, just 10 in Aberdeen. So quite a range as we go through tomorrow. And then through tomorrow night into Thursday, we will see further showers or longer spells of rain drifting northwards. Some of this rain heavy, some of it thundery. Could be quite a wet start to Thursday in the southeast corner. Should see some sunshine developing in places through the day. And still, actually for the time of year, a relatively warm feel, particularly in the south, highs of 19 or 20 degrees. And we stick with that unsettled theme into the weekend. Rain at times, but not all the time. Often windy, but quite warm for the time of year. Jane.
All right, Ben, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And just a reminder of our top story this lunchtime. Ministers have been leaving their weekly meeting in Downing Street. The Prime Minister, Liz Truss, chaired Cabinet this morning after apologising last night for the mistakes she's made since entering number 10. That is it from the BBC News at 1. Goodbye from all of us for today. On BBC One, we'll join our news teams now wherever you are. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.